Creating realistic string MIDI mockups is challenging. It doesn't matter what library you are using. Um, Samples are samples, and they will always be samples, but there are certain things you can do to make whatever samples you happen to be working with at the moment to make them sound much better. So I just wanted to share you a few things that I do, regardless of the sample library I'm using. These are things that I do to make strings, in particular, sound a lot better. Now, these tips can be extended into other sections of the orchestra or whatever samples you're using, but I think for strings, these are a must if you're going for somewhat realistic at all, like any sort of realism. The first thing I like to do is, after I've laid down a track, is figure out whether I want to quantize the track or not. I prefer to quantize just about everything and then fidget around in the piano roll to make sure things are overlapping the right way and are coming in at the right moment. The reason I like to quantize is because I like to substitute real-time playing for tempo variations, which I'll show you later. And that's because I like everything to move at the same tempo, and sometimes I trick my ear. I just find it's less editing if I get everything quantized and then adjust as necessary rather than trying to fix everything to come in at the right moment. Okay, so after you've laid down a track, you open your piano roll and you can see all the notes that you just played in sequence. The color denotes velocity, so depending on if your library uses the mod wheel function or not to control velocity, I prefer libraries that do use the mod wheel for velocity, because then it doesn't matter what MIDI keyboard I'm using, whether it's my really nice MIDI keyboard in my studio or it's a really, really bad, cheap plastic MIDI keyboard when I'm on the road. It doesn't matter. The mod wheel is what controls that. Underneath, so once you open the piano roll, you will click a track and the notes show up. You will click this little left button down here. It's called hyperdraw, and I think it defaults to channel pressure or something like that, and you'll click modulation, and this is where the modulation draw shows up. And when you click notes here, that shows you which modulation. The top is 127 and the bottom is 0. That's pretty standard for MIDI. Just become familiar with the library and what the modulation does. As you can see, the modulation moves up and down depending on the phrase, and the important notes get the higher modulation, and the end of phrases kind of fade out at the end. That's just how music works, generally speaking. Samples are samples, as I said, and they'll always be samples, but a musician, when they're playing notes, they think about dynamics and tempo changes, all that stuff. And you need to be thinking about that as well, because you're ultimately a musician. So where you do the modulation is up to you, and that affects how the samples are played. If your sample library does not use modulation, move on to what I'm about to talk to next, which is volume automation. So I use a combination of volume automation and modulation. So once you've created a track, I have these 5 tracks for strings, and I open my mixer and I select all of them under group 1. To select group 1, you click this button here and you have all these different groups. And once they all have the same number, they will react the same. I can drag and adjust this volume and they all move more or less incrementally the same volume. And that is so they're somewhat unified and I'm not adjusting each track individually. So before you select them all in the group, you're going to want to make sure your volumes are set properly at the right time, or at the right place before they all move at unity. So I had the violas turned down maybe 5 decibels, the violin too, and panned a little bit to the right. Violas were down a little bit too, and I think, yeah, violins, cellos, and basses are all more or less at the same volume. Once you've done that, you can start drawing in volume automation, and your volume will look more or less like your modulation lines. So think of those as somewhat working together to create more realistic samples. Okay, moving on. On top of this, you also want to be aware of tempo modulation. So not only do dynamics grow at the crescendos at the beginning of a phrase and then decrescendos at the end of a phrase, I like to have it speed up a little bit at the beginning of a phrase and slow down a little bit at the end of the phrase. It depends on the music you're doing. This music certainly would call for it. It's very emotional, whatever. So you can open list and you just find the measure you want to slow down. You'll select it in your DAW and then you click tempo. So you go list, tempo, and then you just hit create, and you've created a new tempo. And you can just drag that up or down, whichever way you want to go. And you can make a big list and it plays it back real time. It's very handy. I didn't start doing this until a little while ago, and it really makes a difference in how your music sounds. Okay, another tip is proper voicing. If you can avoid it, two things about that. If you can avoid it, don't use string ensemble patches where the whole string section is on the keyboard. Because if you push for instance, the A below middle C, that's in the cello range, that's in the viola range, and that's in the violin range. And you could simultaneously have 3, or violin 2 also, 4 sections playing that same note. And that's not going to sound real at all. So if you can break your string orchestra into sections, like I have violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, basses. That just helps tremendously with the voicing. Also, you have to remember which melody, if any, has the melody, or which line has the melody. It's very confusing when you have to listen to just blocks of chords and not know exactly what you're listening to. Now, that doesn't necessarily just mean you crank up the volume of the melody. It can mean if the melody is in higher register, it will naturally sound, it will naturally be heard, even if it's relatively soft. So keep that in mind as you mess with the mod wheel and change velocities. If the melody's in the viola line or the cello line, make sure you have it EQ'd to stand out a little bit, or the volume is turned up, and the other accompanying figures, the other accompanying voices, aren't doing too much to distract from the melody. That's a good tip for writing any style of music, I think, but it also is a good orchestrational tip for sequencing. Last and not least, reverb is your friend. So if you're going to use reverb on patches, try and keep the reverb relatively the same for every patch. Some samples come with reverb recorded into the samples, and that's fine, but sometimes it's not enough. So I like to add a little bit extra to help with the legato and the smooth sound. Again, just make sure it's unified, and it's not, you can use buses and sends for that, but it's very easy to just open up a plugin and just use the default that's right there, or copy and paste the settings into one or another. Okay, so the first time you heard this, it was these string patches have legato built into them, and they're very nice string patches, but I also wanted to show you that these things that I do, the tips that I just told you, work in a not so high quality. It's a good string library, but it's not the highest quality compared to the string library I played at first. So I will play you a string, I will play you the same segment with a sample library that does not use the mod wheel. It does not have sampled legato, and velocity, I'm not sure what the velocity samples are, but when you play velocity, it basically just adjusts the volume. So we're only working with volume increase and decrease, and no mod and no sampled legato, which makes a huge difference in terms of price and quality of a library. So that being said, I'll just give you a listen to a very different string library, and you can tell me if my tips worked. All right, thanks for watching. Join me on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Oh, you probably already know me on YouTube. Also, I've got Score Scene 2 coming out, I think, yeah, June 3rd. And I'm really excited to share that pack with you guys. So keep in touch and make sure you know what's going on there. We'll have announcements and tutorials and demos coming up in the future. Thanks for watching.